Welcome to Echoes of Holmes, where shadows whisper secrets. Tonight, the brilliant Sherlock Holmes faces a chilling puzzle. The legacy of the vanished archivist. A missing archivist, a cryptic note, and a hidden truth await what will he uncover. Are you listening late at night or over your morning tea? Pour yourself something warm, draw the curtains close and let the mystery begin. The morning fog lay thick over Baker Street, muffling the distant clatter of hansom cabs and the occasional bark of a street dog. In our modest sitting room, I sat at my writing desk, attempting to put pen to paper, when a brisk rap at our door heralded an arrival that promised neither ordinary social visit nor idle curiosity. Holmes, who had been half reclining in his armchair, pipe in hand, stirred immediately, his dark eyes gleaming with anticipation. "Watson," he said, his voice sharp, yet tinged with that peculiar excitement which so often presaged a new case, "we are about to be engaged in an enterprise of unusual subtlety." Before I could inquire further, Mrs. Hudson announced to our visitor a man of considerable distress, though dressed in the precise and elegant manner of a gentleman accustomed to offices of authority. He introduced himself as Mr. Charles Penhaligon, a senior archivist in the employ of the Royal Historical Society. "I beg your pardon for intruding," he began, fumbling with his hat, "but I am in a most dire and perplexing predicament. My colleague, Mr. Edmund Cavendish, has vanished utterly from the society without a trace. No note, no message, no clue whatsoever." His eyes, dark and urgent, met Holmes's gaze with a silent plea for understanding. Holmes inclined his head slightly. "Vanished, you say? Pray, Mr. Penhaligon, outline the circumstances with precise chronology. Do not omit the slightest detail. The devil, as you know, is often in the minutiae." Penhaligon swallowed nervously. It was 2 days ago. Mr. Cavendish was to prepare a catalogue of newly acquired manuscripts, whilst items of considerable antiquity and value. He left the society at 6 o'clock in the evening, as usual. The next morning he had not reported for work. His home showed no sign of disturbance, yet he was gone. His personal papers remain untouched, save for his ledger, which is inexplicably empty. Scotland Yard has been unable to provide assistance beyond routine inquiries. They believe he simply left of his own accord. But I am certain that is impossible. Cavendish was devoted to his work, a man of impeccable character and utterly incapable of abandoning it or his duties. Holmes's fingers tapped lightly upon the arm of his chair, a rhythm that seemed to correspond with the patterns of his thoughts. "And you, Mr. Penhaligon, are convinced this disappearance is not voluntary?" "Absolutely," Penhaligon replied, his voice trembling. "I fear there is more at stake than mere absence. Certain manuscripts of great historical significance, some not even catalogued, were entrusted to his care. Their security is paramount, and Cavendish alone knew their precise location. If he is indeed taken, or worse, coerced, the implications could be grave." Holmes rose abruptly, moving to the window and peering out at the grey London streets. "Interesting," he murmured. "So the disappearance of one man threatens the safety of antiquities of national importance, and Scotland Yard, with its usual efficiency, has reached precisely no conclusions." He turned, eyes gleaming. "Watson, we must pay a visit to this Royal Historical Society immediately. Every element of a complex puzzle is present: the disappearance, the manuscripts, and the very human factor of fear and devotion. Such cases are a rare delight, for they demand that one look beyond the obvious." As we prepared to depart, I could not suppress a pang of foreboding. The world of archivists, of dusty ledgers and hidden manuscripts, seemed a quiet and safe one. Yet, as Holmes so often reminded me, the outwardly tranquil hides the extraordinary. And in the case of Edmund Cavendish, I felt certain that the extraordinary had arrived at our doorstep. The streets of London were still shrouded in the silvery fog when Holmes and I set out for the Royal Historical Society, the chill air cutting through my overcoat and sending a shiver down my spine. I observed Holmes with a mixture of curiosity and admiration, noting the brisk, purposeful stride he always assumed when a case had taken hold of his mind. There was a sparkle in his eyes on anticipation that seemed to quicken the very pulse of the morning. He spoke little, yet every now and then he would comment on some seemingly trivial aspect of the city around us. "Observe, Watson," he said, nodding toward a shop window cluttered with a display of brass compasses and pocket watches. "The proprietors have carefully polished the faces, yet neglected the hinges. One might deduce that a careful hand maintains appearances, yet the underlying structure is ignored. A curious habit among the bourgeois." I noted his remark, though at first it seemed irrelevant to the disappearance of Mr. Cavendish. Yet, as always, I reminded myself that Holmes's observations, however apparently unrelated, were the first pieces of a larger puzzle. We arrived at the Society's stately building on Piccadilly Street, its facade a dignified testament to centuries of scholarship. The heavy double doors were opened by a portly doorman who regarded us with the mild suspicion reserved for strangers in such institutions. Holmes ignored him, moving with quiet authority through the entrance hall and into the Society's main offices where Mr. Penhaligon awaited us, pacing like a caged lion. "Ah, gentlemen," he said, bowing hurriedly. "I am grateful you came so promptly. I feared the situation would continue to deteriorate without your involvement." Holmes's sharp eyes swept the room with calculated precision. "Show me the scene of Mr. Cavendish's last work," he commanded. "We shall begin at the point of greatest significance." Penhaligon led us through a narrow corridor lined with shelves of manuscripts, the musty scent of parchment and ink heavy in the air. We entered a small, sparsely furnished office. A sturdy oak desk stood at the centre, its surface neatly arranged with papers, quills, and a few open ledgers. A single lamp cast a pool of yellow light over the workspace, revealing a faint impression in the blotter where a page had once rested. Holmes approached the desk and began to examine the objects with meticulous care, handling each item with the delicate precision of a surgeon. I, meanwhile, attempted to absorb the environment, noting the absence of disturbance but also the subtle irregularities. A chair slightly angled away from the desk, a faint scuff on the wooden floor, and the irregular alignment of the ledgers. "Notice, Watson," Holmes murmured, almost to himself, "that the ledger which should have contained Cavendish's recent cataloguing remains conspicuously empty, yet the ink on the desk blotter is faintly imprinted with what appears to be shorthand notations. Peculiar, is it not? A man so devoted to his work would hardly leave even a single task unfinished." I bent closer, struggling to discern the faint impressions. "I see the marks, Holmes, but they are nearly illegible. What do they suggest?" Holmes straightened suddenly, turning his keen gaze upon me. "They suggest, my dear Watson, that Cavendish either took extraordinary precautions to conceal his work, or that another party had a hand in this disappearance. And notice, if you will, the absence of forced entry shows no sign that a struggle occurred. This was not a matter of simple theft or abduction by crude means. We are dealing with a mind as precise and disciplined as Cavendish himself, or one who understands his habits intimately." Penhaligon, who had been listening with a mixture of awe and trepidation, spoke up. "You believe someone removed him deliberately? But for what purpose? There is nothing in his personal life to suggest enemies, no financial debts, no scandal. He was utterly devoted to his work." Holmes inclined his head slightly. "Precisely, Mr. Penhaligon. That devotion, combined with the nature of the manuscripts, suggests a motive of a very particular sort, one that values knowledge and secrecy above all else. Rare manuscripts and forgotten histories, Watson, are treasures to some men more than gold or jewels, and men who covet such treasures are often silent, meticulous, and unfortunately dangerous. I made a note of his words, though the depth of implication had not yet fully penetrated my understanding. Holmes, however, had already moved to a nearby bookcase, examining the lower shelves with his accustomed intensity. He tapped lightly on a row of volumes, producing faint echoes that suggested hollowness behind certain bindings. "Curious," he murmured. "Observe the wear upon these volumes, particularly this one." He held up a thin folio, its spine nearly worn through from repeated handling, and ran his thumb along the cover. It appears to have been accessed far more frequently than the others, yet it is scarcely catalogued in our inventory. A minor detail, perhaps, yet in such cases the minor often outweighs the major. Penhaligon's brows furrowed. That book Cavendish often consulted it in the evenings. I presumed it merely contained reference notes, nothing of significance. Holmes' eyes gleamed. "Reference notes, Mr. Penhaligon, are rarely mere reference notes. And note, Watson, that the dust upon this folio has been disturbed unevenly, as if it had been removed hastily and replaced. A small, almost imperceptible clue, yet it tells us that the book has played a part in recent events." As I attempted to comprehend the subtleties Holmes had uncovered, there came a knock at the office door. Inspector Lestrade entered, his usual air of officiousness tempered by evident frustration. "Holmes," he said gruffly, "I understand you are already examining the situation." "Scotland Yard has conducted every standard inquiry, questioned neighbours, inspected Cavendish's residence, checked trains, hansoms, and cab stands. Yet the man vanished without trace. If you claim to have insight, I am prepared to listen, but do not waste time with trifles." Holmes, with a faint smile, turned his penetrating gaze upon Lestrade. "On the contrary, Inspector, trifles are our currency in cases such as this. Every scuff, every smudge, every minor inconsistency may prove pivotal. You may rely upon my methods, however unconventional they may seem, to illuminate the path that has eluded your officers." Lestrade's frown deepened, but he nodded curtly. "Very well, then. But do not tarry. The public grows impatient when the reputation of the society is at stake." Once the inspector departed, Holmes resumed his examination of the desk and its surroundings, his concentration absolute. "Watson," he said softly, "we must consider not only the environment but also the man himself. Edmund Cavendish is a meticulous archivist, a scholar of unrivalled diligence. Yet even a man of such habit is subject to external influence. It is my belief that the circumstances of his disappearance were orchestrated with careful knowledge of his routines, his virtues, and his weaknesses." I attempted to follow Holmes's line of reasoning, but the interweaving of motives and minute observations left my head spinning. Holmes, sensing my perplexity, smiled faintly. "Do not worry, my dear Watson. The threads are numerous, but they will converge, as all threads in a well-constructed web do, upon a central truth. Our task is to untangle them without disturbing the pattern prematurely." As we left the society that morning, Holmes paused to glance once more at the building's entrance. "Watson, I have made note of several key observations. The impression in the blotter, the disturbed folio, and the absence of forced entry are merely the surface. Beneath lies a design, subtle yet deliberate. I anticipate that within the next 24 hours our inquiries will yield additional fragments of information. When they do, the full picture, though still incomplete, will begin to emerge." Walking back through the misty streets, I reflected on Holmes' words. The case was already proving to be a labyrinth of shadows, one in which human character and intellectual ambition intersected in a perilous dance, and I, as ever, felt both awe and trepidation at the journey before us, knowing that the resolution, when it arrived, would challenge the very limits of observation, deduction, and insight. The following morning dawned with a pall of persistent drizzle that made the streets of London glisten with wet cobblestones and reflecting gas lamps. Holmes and I returned to the Royal Historical Society, this time intent on examining not only the office, but the surrounding environs where Edmund Cavendish might have ventured or been taken. Holmes moved with his habitual precision, noting details that would escape the casual observer. The angle of a doorknob, the faint smudges on a windowsill, the footprints on the steps that led to the rear courtyard. "Observe, Watson," he murmured, crouching beside a barely discernible impression in the soil, the subtle indentation of a gentleman's shoe, size 9.5, polished, recent. Compared with the mud upon the entrance threshold, the soil here is slightly disturbed, as though someone retraced their steps in haste. Note the direction toward the east side alley. It is a minor observation, yet it speaks volumes when placed in context. I leaned closer, straining to see what Holmes had uncovered. "It could be anyone," I said, sceptical of the significance. Holmes shook his head gently. "Not quite anyone, Watson. Only someone of Cavendish's stature could traverse these steps in such a precise manner, and yet the trajectory hints at hurried thought, a purpose unfulfilled." We entered the alley he indicated, a narrow corridor flanked by brick walls slick with rain. The alley was deserted, save for the occasional rat skittering along the damp ground. Holmes's eyes roved over the scene with the intensity of a hawk. He bent to examine a discarded scrap of paper, soiled and crumpled. "Remarkable," he whispered, brushing away the grime, "a fragment of a letter, merely a few words, though faintly legible, meet the usual. The rest is obliterated. Yet this, Watson, is our first tangible clue beyond the obvious absence." I studied the paper. "But it is hardly a complete message. How can we infer meaning from so little?" Holmes's eyes twinkled. "Precisely, my dear fellow. It is incomplete, yes, but in such fragments lies human intention. Note the penmanship. Cavendish's hand is meticulous, yet here we see haste, perhaps nervousness. And the choice of words, the usual, indicates a prearranged location, known only to him and his correspondent. Whoever orchestrated his disappearance understood this and sought to exploit it. We returned to the society, and Holmes requested access to Cavendish's personal quarters within the building, a small office adjacent to the main archives. Here I began to feel the peculiar thrill of anticipation that often accompanied Holmes's investigations. Every object seemed to hide a secret: a quill slightly askew, a ledger marginally out of alignment, a faint odour of ink more pungent in certain areas. Holmes's gaze fixed upon a set of shelves lined with manuscripts of varying sizes. He tapped one of the volumes lightly with his finger. "Watson, the arrangement is curious. Note the inconsistency. The larger folios have been inserted among smaller ones. It suggests hasty placement. Perhaps someone intended to obscure their importance or divert attention from a particular volume." I bent over to inspect the shelves more closely, but the significance eluded me. Holmes, however, had already begun opening the folios, scanning the contents with an intensity that left me breathless. "The ledger Cavendish kept," he said after several minutes, "is of interest. It contains regular entries, inventory numbers, accession dates, provenance notes. Yet, curiously, the last page bears only a cryptic notation G12. Nothing else. Could it be a page number?" I asked. "Perhaps," Holmes replied, "or a reference to a specific manuscript. I intend to cross-check this with the catalogue immediately. A minor detail, yet one that may reveal intention, location, or even a schedule. As Holmes worked, Penhaligon brought forward a small collection of letters recently found in Cavendish's desk. Many were mundane correspondence, requests for access, donations, scholarly queries, but one caught Holmes' attention instantly. "Observe, Watson," he said, holding the letter delicately by its edges. "The postmark is from Hammersmith, yet it is addressed to the Society, not Cavendish personally. The tone is courteous, almost deferential, yet the language hints at persuasion and an effort to encourage trust, perhaps to lure the recipient." He opened the letter carefully and read aloud. "The matter of the ancient collection is of utmost discretion. Your understanding of the nuances will prove invaluable. I await your presence at the usual time and place. The matter cannot be delayed." Holmes' eyes narrowed. "A deliberate attempt, Watson, to summon Cavendish. The language is intended to engage his scholarly pride, yet conceal the true purpose. Whoever wrote this understands Cavendish intimately, his habits, his ambitions, even his vulnerabilities." We then turned to examine Cavendish's personal journals stored in a locked cabinet. Penhaligon provided the key, trembling slightly. Holmes leafed through the pages rapidly, his gaze flicking between sentences and dates, absorbing both content and nuance. "There is a rhythm to his daily entries," Holmes murmured, "a cadence that reflects disciplined thought. Yet here, on the last day recorded, there is a deviation abrupt, almost imperceptible, but present nonetheless. He makes note of a visitor from Hammersmith, a gentleman with a timely request, but then the entry is interrupted as though he was called away. No further details." "So someone arrived unexpectedly," I said. "Could that be the person who caused his disappearance?" "Possibly," Holmes replied, "or it may have been an intermediary messenger, not the principal actor. Observe, Watson, how the subtlety of human behavior informs us. Cavendish's meticulous habits were disrupted not violently, but through calculated psychological means. This is no ordinary abduction. It is orchestrated with a scholar's precision." Holmes then examined the floor around the cabinet, bending low. "Do you notice, Watson, the faint traces of chalk dust? It suggests movement of a manuscript or folio, likely a document of some importance. The intruder, or perhaps Cavendish himself, handled it carefully, indicating knowledge of its value. And note the direction of the disturbance toward the eastern window, which provides egress to the alley we examined earlier." I tried to assimilate Holmes's rapid deductions. "So he may have been led out willingly, or at least guided." "Precisely," Holmes said, rising. "A clever person manipulates a willing participant far more efficiently than a resistant one. Cavendish's devotion to his work made him predictable, and therefore susceptible. And Watson, the beauty of such manipulation lies in its invisibility. If executed correctly, no one will suspect coercion, only a voluntary absence." By mid-afternoon we returned to Baker Street, our minds occupied with the complex puzzle. Holmes was uncharacteristically pensive, walking about the room with hands clasped behind him. "Watson," he said finally, pausing beside the mantel, "this case possesses all the hallmarks of an intellectual challenge. A man vanished, not by brute force, but through subtle artifice. Manuscripts of considerable value hang in the balance, and the manipulator is careful to leave nearly no trace. Our task is to reconstruct the unseen steps, to read the actions of others as one reads a book. Each clue we gather now is a word, a phrase, a sentence that will ultimately reveal the narrative in full." I sat quietly, recording every detail, aware that Holmes had already begun connecting invisible threads that eluded my perception. The morning's discoveries had provided only the merest glimpse of the intricacy of the scheme, and I understood that the days ahead would require relentless attention to the faintest traces. As dusk fell over the city, I could not shake a sense of foreboding. The missing Cavendish, the cryptic notations, the anonymous summons all hinted at forces at work, more deliberate and cunning than I had yet encountered. And yet I trusted Holmes implicitly, knowing that his mind, honed to detect the slightest irregularity, would ultimately illuminate the shadows in which others saw only darkness. The following morning found Baker Street shrouded in the familiar grey mist, the city quiet, save for the occasional clatter of a passing cab and the distant toll of St. Marylebone's clock. Holmes and I made our way once more to the Royal Historical Society, determined to broaden the scope of our inquiries. While the previous day had been devoted to subtle examination of the physical environment and Cavendish's personal habits, today's endeavour required interviews with colleagues, associates, and anyone who might have known of the vanished archivist's intentions. Our first interview was with Miss Clarissa Durnford, a junior assistant in the Society who had worked closely with Cavendish. She greeted us with visible apprehension, her hands nervously wringing the hem of her apron. "Miss Durnford," Holmes began, his voice courteous yet edged with authority, "I understand that you were in frequent contact with Mr. Cavendish. Did he ever mention any concerns, disagreements, or unusual visitors in recent days?" Miss Durnford's gaze darted toward the door, as though fearing eavesdroppers. "No, sir. Cavendish was always meticulous. He was devoted to his work, and though he spoke little of personal matters, I never noticed any cause for concern. But there was one gentleman, Mr. Harrington, who visited the Society twice last week. He was insistent, I suppose you might say, about viewing some manuscripts." Cavendish seemed uneasy, though he tried to remain polite. Holmes leaned forward, steepling his fingers. "Describe Mr. Harrington for me. Appearance, manner, anything." Miss Durnford hesitated. He was tall, thin, with sharp features, and a certain air of confidence, almost arrogance. He spoke quickly and yet with careful diction, as though he had rehearsed every word. Cavendish seemed to regard him with caution, but he allowed the visitor access to some manuscripts nonetheless. Holmes nodded, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Interesting. A man who presses too hard for access to sensitive materials is rarely motivated by benign curiosity. And yet note the subtlety Cavendish did not refuse outright. Such hesitation may indicate the first signs of a conflict that escalated later. After interviewing Miss Durnford, we turned our attention to Mr. Charles Penhaligon, who had been involved in supervising the archives. Penhaligon was naturally anxious, but he seemed eager to assist. "Holmes," he began, wringing his hands, "I have considered Mr. Harrington myself. He is a known collector of rare manuscripts, often engaging with scholars to obtain access. Yet he has always maintained a veneer of respectability. Could he truly be involved in Cavendish's disappearance?" Holmes tapped his chin thoughtfully. "Respectability is rarely an obstacle to determination, Mr. Penhaligon. It is often a cloak for ambition and desire. And consider the timing of 2 visits within 1 week, coupled with Cavendish's unease. Circumstantial, yes, but we shall see if it holds weight upon further scrutiny. We decided to visit Mr. Harrington at his residence in Bloomsbury. The house was modest but tastefully furnished, with numerous books and manuscripts on display. A young footman admitted us, ushering us into a parlour where Harrington awaited a tall, gaunt man with keen eyes that seemed to pierce the very soul. "Mr. Harrington," Holmes began politely, "we come regarding Mr. Edmund Cavendish. Your recent visits to the Royal Historical Society have been noted. Perhaps you can clarify the purpose of your interest in certain manuscripts." Harrington's expression remained composed, yet his fingers drummed nervously upon the arm of his chair. "I merely wish to examine some rare acquisitions," he replied smoothly. Cavendish is a scholar of repute, and I wished for his guidance in understanding the provenance of certain texts. I assure you I would never harm the man or interfere with his work." Holmes' gaze was unyielding, and yet you pressed for access on more than one occasion, despite apparent hesitation on his part. "How do you explain this persistence?" Harrington's lips tightened. Curiosity, a desire for knowledge, nothing more. Holmes leaned back slightly, his eyes glinting. "A plausible explanation, certainly. Yet you must understand, Mr. Harrington, that plausibility and truth are not always synonymous. One may behave plausibly while concealing a motive entirely different. Tell me, did you notice anything unusual about Mr. Cavendish's demeanour during your visits?" Harrington paused, choosing his words with care. He was distracted, perhaps concerned with his work, as scholars often are. Nothing remarkable beyond that. Holmes inclined his head, as though noting the subtle inconsistencies in Harrington's manner. "Thank you, sir. We shall consider your account." On leaving Harrington's residence, I expressed my doubts aloud. "Holmes, he seems sincere. Could we be attributing malice where none exists?" Holmes waved a hand dismissively. "Watson, sincerity is an unreliable indicator. Men of ambition conceal motives behind civility. Our task is to look beyond appearances, to detect the faintest trace of intent." Returning to the society, Holmes requested to inspect the security records and visitor logs. He examined the ledgers meticulously, noting the precise times of entry and departure for all visitors, the signatures, and even the slight variations in handwriting. "Watson," he said finally, "considered the pattern Harrington visited twice. Yes, but observed the intervals. Both visits coincided with periods when Cavendish had previously noted unusual deliveries or correspondence. Timing is crucial. A man may appear casual, yet the placement of his actions within a sequence reveals much more than words alone. At that moment, Inspector Lestrade arrived once more, looking weary, yet eager to contribute. He presented a report compiled from his officer's observations of the surrounding neighbourhood. There were sightings, Lestrade said, of a man matching Cavendish's description near Hammersmith early on the morning of his disappearance. Some claim he was accompanied by another man, though the evidence is vague. It could be Harrington, though there is no certainty. Holmes's eyes gleamed. "Precisely, Inspector. This is the moment when speculation must yield to careful deduction. Every witness carries bias, every recollection is flawed. Our role is to weigh these accounts against the physical evidence and human behaviour, discerning where truth hides." Over the next several hours, Holmes pieced together the timeline with Penhaligon and Miss Durnford's assistance. He analysed letters, visitor logs, ledger entries, and journal notations, constructing a tentative sequence of events. Yet, even as the framework emerged, a sense of incompleteness remained. "Watson," Holmes said as we paused for a brief rest in the Society's quiet reading room, "we had our first suspect. Yes, Mr. Harrington. He possesses motive, opportunity, and the appearance of reasoned intent. But I caution you that the surface of this mystery is deceptive. The ease with which a case appears solved is often inversely proportional to the truth hidden beneath." I nodded, appreciating Holmes's insistence on patience and thoroughness. "So our next step is to examine him further, to observe and interrogate." "Exactly," Holmes replied, though with caution. "A clever man will detect over-eagerness and close the avenues of information. We must allow the suspect to reveal himself, willingly or inadvertently, by the pattern of his own actions rather than by our demands. Misdirection is often the principal tool of the guilty. Our job is to penetrate it, layer by layer." As we departed for Baker Street that evening, the fog had thickened, wrapping the city in a dense shroud that seemed almost a metaphor for the confusion enveloping the case. I reflected on the day's discoveries, Cavendish's disappearance, Harrington's suspicious behaviour, the cryptic letters, and the subtle disturbances in the Society's manuscripts. Each element was a thread in a web of uncertainty, and I could sense that Holmes was already weaving them together in a pattern invisible to all but his extraordinary mind. By the time we reached Tomb 21B, I was weary, yet exhilarated. The first suspect had emerged, yet Holmes's cautious approach suggested that the truth lay deeper still. And as I had come to expect in all cases under his scrutiny, the outwardly obvious was seldom the real answer. Somewhere within the fog of London, the invisible hand guiding Cavendish's disappearance remained at work, and Holmes alone seemed capable of tracing its intricate movements. The following day dawned grey and oppressive, with a persistent drizzle coating the streets of London in a slick sheen. Holmes, unusually restless, had been pacing our sitting room since first light, his long fingers clasped behind his back as he muttered to himself in a manner I had learned to interpret as deep, analytical thought. I observed him with curiosity, noting that his expression alternated between intense focus and the faintest trace of amusement, as though he were privy to a private revelation that had yet to reach my comprehension. "Watson," he said abruptly, breaking the silence, "the matter of Edmund Cavendish's disappearance presents not only the challenge of his physical absence, but also the intricacy of intention. You may recall the fragmentary letter discovered yesterday, meet at the usual and the timing of Mr. Harrington's visits. Both point toward a careful orchestration of events, yet there is an inconsistency, subtle but significant, that has escaped the notice of every observer, including our diligent friends at Scotland Yard." I leaned forward eagerly, sensing the import in Holmes's tone. "An inconsistency, Holmes? Can you share it with me?" Holmes shook his head, a faint smile playing about his lips. "Not yet, Watson. To reveal it prematurely would be to scatter the pattern. Our task is to gather additional fragments of information to allow the threads to coalesce naturally. Patience is paramount." By mid-morning, we returned to the Royal Historical Society, where Penhaligon had arranged access to Cavendish's personal correspondence and additional archival records. Holmes immediately took to examining the letters, comparing handwriting, ink and style with the precision of a master cryptographer. "Observe, Watson," he said after some minutes, "the difference between the fragmentary letter we discovered in the alley and the other correspondence sent to Cavendish by his known associates. The paper is identical, yes, but the ink differs slightly in viscosity and hue. It is a subtle distinction, invisible to anyone not trained in close observation. This suggests a deliberate attempt to mimic authenticity while introducing a false trail. And note the linguistic nuances. The phrasing is intended to appeal to Cavendish's scholarly pride, yet it lacks the precise rhythm he expects in professional correspondence. I marvelled at Holmes's acuity, struggling to reconcile my own perception with his insight. So the letter was designed to lure him, yet not appear unusual at first glance. "Exactly," Holmes replied. "An expertly crafted deception. And yet it is the flaw within that perfection, the imperceptible divergence, that constitutes the true clue. Such details are overlooked by the careless, yet they reveal the hand of a cunning manipulator." Holmes then turned to the Society's ledgers and journal entries, comparing Cavendish's meticulous cataloguing with the subtle disturbances noted in the manuscripts. He moved methodically, his eyes scanning the pages as if reading not only the words but the intentions behind them. "Watson, do you see this?" he said, pointing to a series of entries concerning recent acquisitions from private collectors. Cavendish noted the arrival of several manuscripts with unusually ornate bindings. Most were logged without comment, yet one folio bears the annotation, "Pending verification of authenticity." Curious, is it not, that this particular manuscript, unlike all others, has not been referenced elsewhere in his journals? I considered the anomaly. Could it be that he had simply not yet completed his examination? Holmes shook his head. Possible, but improbable. Cavendish was meticulous to a fault. He would not have ignored a manuscript of significance for even a single day without making a note. This omission is deliberate, or at least the result of interference. And here, Watson, we begin to glimpse the invisible hand that shaped his disappearance. Our attention then turned to the eastern alley where Cavendish had been observed prior to vanishing. Holmes examined the pavement, noting faint traces of mud and chalk dust, remnants of the previous day's inspection. He bent low, using a magnifying glass to inspect the ground, and then stood suddenly. "Watson," he said, excitement tinged in his voice, "there is something here, subtle yet unmistakable. A slight smudge upon the wall, no more than a finger's breadth in length, and traces of chalk upon the cobblestones. It suggests that a manuscript or document was transported along this route, yet not in the manner of a theft or hurried removal. The movements are deliberate, precise, almost reverent. Who, I ask you, would handle a document with such care, yet leave no overt trace of its transport?" I considered this the image of a figure moving silently through the alley, forming in my mind. "It seems almost impossible, Holmes. Who could accomplish such a task unnoticed?" Holmes's lips curved into a faint smile. "Precisely. The impossible often yields to careful observation. Consider the handwriting, the arrangement of documents, the timing of visitors. All point to someone intimately familiar with Cavendish's habits, yet who also understands the subtle art of misdirection. It is a masterstroke of psychological manipulation. By mid-afternoon, Holmes requested to revisit Cavendish's personal quarters within the society. This time, he examined the room with an intensity that bordered on obsession, scrutinizing every surface, every shelf, every faint discoloration upon the walls. I could see the tension in his posture as he pieced together fragments invisible to my less practiced eye. "There," he whispered, pointing to a barely noticeable indentation on the floor near a bookshelf. "A displaced tile, Watson. No casual visitor would have noticed it. And yet, here is a precise alteration in the floor, barely detectable, suggesting a hidden compartment or mechanism. Cavendish would never leave such a thing unexamined. The presence of this alteration indicates intentional concealment by him or by another." I bent to examine the tile, but Holmes waved me back. "No, Watson, do not disturb it. The significance of this clue must be understood in the context of all others. A premature disturbance could obliterate the evidence entirely." As we left the society, Holmes was unusually silent, his mind clearly occupied with the pattern of events, yet to be fully deciphered. Once back at Baker Street, he resumed his pacing, hands clasped, eyes fixed on some distant point that seemed to exist only in his own perception. "Watson," he said finally, breaking the silence, "what we have observed today is, in essence, a tapestry of human intention. Cavendish's disappearance is not a simple act of violence or caprice. It is the result of deliberate orchestration, executed with knowledge of his character, habits, and routines. And within this tapestry lies a subtle irregularity secret clue that, when understood, will illuminate the entire design." I leaned back in my chair, eager yet cautious. "Holmes, can we hope to identify this secret clue soon? It seems tantalizingly close, yet frustratingly elusive." Holmes smiled faintly, a glint of triumph in his eyes. "Patience, Watson. We are on the brink of revelation, though the final connections remain hidden. The key is not merely to gather information, but to interpret it with precision. Tomorrow we shall follow the next thread, which I suspect will lead us to a fuller understanding of both Cavendish's fate and the identity of the architect of his disappearance." As dusk settled over the city, I reflected on the day's discoveries. Holmes had uncovered subtleties that seemed inconsequential to the casual observer, yet I sensed their importance. The secret clue, imperceptible to all but Holmes, lay somewhere within the mundane details we had examined. I could only marvel at his ability to perceive the invisible and to draw meaning from the faintest traces of human action, anticipating the next stage of the investigation with both trepidation and awe. The morning air was heavy with mist and the scent of damp cobblestones when Holmes and I left Baker Street to pursue a new lead, suggested by the secret clue he had discerned the previous day. Though he was unusually quiet during the walk, his eyes darted from shadow to shadow, observing details invisible to the untrained eye, a faint smudge on a lamppost, the scuff marks of boots upon the pavement, the delicate pattern of puddles reflecting the foggy skyline. His mind, I could sense, was turning over every possibility, weighing each against the invisible hand he had already begun to trace. "Watson," he said at length, "we are entering a stage where observation alone will not suffice. Human action now intersects with circumstance, and the consequences may be profound. The missing Cavendish is no longer merely an absent scholar. He has become a fulcrum upon which the intentions of another pivot. We must proceed with caution, for a second misstep could obliterate the trail entirely." Our first destination was the residence of Mr. Harrington, the tall, gaunt gentleman whose visits to the society had aroused suspicion. Holmes was keen to observe his reactions under renewed scrutiny to see if subtle cues of tension, distraction, or calculated deception would reveal themselves. Harrington greeted us with the same polished composure, yet a flicker of unease passed briefly over his sharp features. "Good morning, gentlemen," Harrington said smoothly. "I trust your inquiries proceed satisfactorily?" Holmes inclined his head slightly. "Indeed, Mr. Harrington, we are merely verifying details to ensure no inadvertent omission compromises the investigation." "May I ask if you have made any personal visits to Hammersmith recently?" Harrington's expression betrayed a momentary hesitation before he recovered. "I may have visited once or twice, but for matters unrelated to the society. I assure you there is no connection to Mr. Cavendish's absence." Holmes's gaze was unrelenting. "Your word is noted, sir. Yet I must emphasize that appearances can be deceptive, and truth often lies in what is omitted rather than what is revealed." After our visit, Holmes led me to a narrow thoroughfare near the society, where the faintest traces of chalk and mud had been noted days earlier. He moved deliberately, kneeling to examine a subtle depression in the cobblestones. "Watson," he murmured, "observe the irregularity in these impressions. They are not consistent with simple passages. Someone has retraced steps, deliberately masking their movement while transporting an object. Note also the faint residual chalk dust mingled with what appears to be powdered pigment. A manuscript or folio handled with care was carried through this route." I studied the evidence, my mind racing to connect it with Harrington's ambiguous account. "So Cavendish may have been guided or coerced along this path?" Holmes nodded. "Guided, yes. Coerced, perhaps. But the subtleties suggest psychological manipulation rather than brute force. The individual responsible understands Cavendish intimately, his habits, his pride, and his devotion to the manuscripts, and that knowledge is now a weapon." By early afternoon, news arrived from Scotland Yard of another disturbance at the Society. A young clerk had discovered that a recently catalogued folio, thought securely stored, was missing from its designated shelf. The alarm was immediate, and Lestrade requested Holmes's presence. "The manuscript," Lestrade said upon our arrival, "was last accounted for 2 days ago. Its disappearance is troubling, and some of our officers suggest a connection to Cavendish's vanishing. I leave it to you, Holmes, to determine whether this is coincidence or design." Holmes examined the empty shelf and the surrounding volumes with meticulous care. coincidence, Inspector, is rarely present, where human intention dominates. Note the pattern. The folio was of unusual significance, corresponding to the annotation pending verification of authenticity found in Cavendish's ledger. Its removal is no accident. The perpetrator possesses knowledge of both the manuscripts and the cataloguing system, indicating familiarity with the society's inner workings. Penhaligon, who had accompanied us, appeared distraught. But Holmes, who else could have such knowledge? Cavendish was careful to restrict access, and I alone have been involved in the cataloguing process. Surely it could not be an outsider. Holmes's eyes glimmered with insight. Precisely, Mr. Penhaligon. An outsider would be unlikely to move undetected or select the specific manuscript with such accuracy. The individual responsible is either someone from within the society or someone with extensive study of its systems and Cavendish's habits. And note that the absence of forced entries suggests either complicity or subterfuge. As Holmes continued his inspection, I noted the tension in his movements. Unlike the calm, deliberate pace of his usual examinations, there was an almost restless intensity, as though the situation had escalated beyond mere scholarly interest. "Watson," he said suddenly, straightening and pacing the room, "we are entering a critical phase. The disappearance of Cavendish and the removal of this folio are not isolated events. They form a sequence, deliberate and interconnected, designed to obscure motive and confuse observation. If we are to prevent further loss or, worse, uncover the true fate of the missing archivist, we must act decisively, following the pattern of intention rather than merely the trail of evidence." I followed him as he moved to the ledgers once more, cross-referencing dates, entries, and visitors' signatures. His rapid calculations, almost invisible to the untrained eye, began to reveal a sequence. Certain visitors arrived shortly after Cavendish had made specific notations. Others departed just prior to the folio's disappearance. The alignment was subtle, yet Holmes perceived the underlying rhythm. "The significance," he said finally, pausing to meet my gaze, "lies in the orchestration." Cavendish's routines, combined with external pressures, were exploited to create a facade of voluntary absence. But the removal of the folio confirms deliberate interference. The stakes have risen, Watson. The perpetrator is not content with a single act. They intend to manipulate events further, and their ultimate aim is likely to remain obscured until they choose otherwise. We left the society late in the afternoon, the fog deepening as if to mirror the growing complexity of the case. Holmes remained unusually silent, his mind clearly tracing the unseen steps of the manipulator. I, too, felt the weight of uncertainty, recognizing that each discovery now seemed to reveal not clarity, but additional layers of complication. At Baker Street, Holmes pored over his notes, pacing the room with restless energy. "Watson," he said finally, "the events of today indicate one unavoidable truth. The situation has escalated. Cavendish's disappearance and the folio's removal are pieces of a larger design, one that will require not only observation and deduction, but also strategy. The manipulator is confident, bold, and cunning. Our task is to anticipate, to predict, and to corner the unseen hand without revealing our own. Only then can the pattern be discerned in its entirety." I watched him, noting the intensity that had grown with each hour. The stakes were higher now than ever before. The missing Cavendish, the stolen manuscript, and the unknown figure orchestrating these events all hinted at a design both intricate and dangerous. I realized, as I often did in Holmes's presence, that the resolution of this case would require every ounce of intellect, intuition, and patience we could muster. As night fell over London, the gas lamps flickering through the dense fog, I reflected on the day's developments. Holmes had revealed only fragments of the pattern, yet even these suggested a careful and deliberate orchestration beyond ordinary comprehension. The disappearance, once a puzzle in isolation, now formed part of a sequence that threatened to reveal far more than a missing scholar. The game, I sensed, had taken on a new urgency, and the moves of the unseen opponent would demand all of Holmes's extraordinary skill to counter. The following morning, a brisk wind swept across Baker Street, ruffling the newspaper pages I had left scattered upon the table. Holmes, already upright and pacing with an intensity I had grown accustomed to, seemed to radiate a restless energy that hinted he had conceived a plan. His eyes, dark and penetrating, glimmered with the anticipation of a strategist surveying the battlefield, and I could not help but sense that the resolution of our mystery was drawing nearer not through chance, but by his deliberate orchestration. "Watson," he began without preamble, "we have collected sufficient information to construct a tentative pattern of movements regarding both Cavendish and the manipulator. Yet the challenge is not merely analytical, it is psychological. We must create circumstances that compel the hidden hand to act, thereby revealing itself." I leaned forward, intrigued. "Do you mean to set a trap, Holmes?" "Precisely," he said, his tone crisp, "but a trap not of physical danger but one of intellect. By establishing a situation that the manipulator cannot resist, we shall observe their behavior, infer motive, and ultimately bring the scheme to light. To succeed, we must appeal to the very habits and pride that have guided Cavendish's disappearance and the theft of the folio." Holmes spent the morning in quiet preparation, carefully arranging letters, messages, and minor disturbances in both the society and nearby locations, creating subtle cues designed to draw the perpetrator out. He instructed me to accompany him as he delivered a series of messages under the guise of correspondence for Cavendish, while also noting the reactions of those who had access to the Society's archives. Each movement was precise, calibrated to elicit maximum effect without revealing our awareness of the manipulator's existence. By midday, we returned to the Society, ostensibly to inspect the shelves yet again, though Holmes's true intent lay in observation. I could sense his mind moving several steps ahead, calculating the possible responses of Harrington, Penhaligon, or any other individual with knowledge of the archives. "Watson," he said, kneeling to examine the subtle chalk markings along the alley we had surveyed previously, observing the faint dust residue. "We have deliberately left a minor disturbance, visible only to those whose attention to detail rivals our own. The manipulator, confident in their skill, will note it immediately and act upon it, believing themselves unseen. In doing so, they will reveal the path they intended to keep hidden." I followed Holmes closely as he conducted the small, deliberate provocations, a ledger partially open to a blank page, a manuscript repositioned slightly, a chair angled differently from its usual alignment. Each minor adjustment, seemingly insignificant to the casual eye, was calculated to appeal to the compulsions of a meticulous mind, the very traits that had defined Cavendish. By late afternoon, Holmes had orchestrated the final stage of his strategy. He explained the importance of patience and discretion, emphasizing that we must observe quietly without interference and allow the manipulator to commit to action. "Watson," he said, "it is one thing to uncover a trail after the fact. It is quite another to force the hand and witness intention itself. This is the juncture at which the mystery begins to yield to intellect, provided we do not misstep." We stationed ourselves in a discreet vantage point overlooking the Society's rear courtyard. Holmes, cloaked in a dark overcoat to obscure his identity, whispered instructions regarding observation and the subtle signals I should note. I, as ever, was charged with recording every detail, though I could already see that Holmes required nothing but the raw data. The interpretation would be his alone. Hours passed with the slow, deliberate cadence of London's afternoon. Footsteps echoed against the cobblestones, carriages rumbled along distant streets, and yet no discernible movement occurred in the courtyard. I began to doubt whether our strategy would succeed, but Holmes remained calm, his gaze fixed on the scene as though he could see invisible threads guiding the events. At last, a shadow emerged from the alley figure, moving with careful deliberation, carrying a small satchel. Holmes's eyes narrowed, and he whispered softly, "Observe, Watson. Note the gait, the angle of approach, and the cautious inspection of the surroundings. This is a practiced hand, confident, yet deliberate." The figure paused near the previously disturbed manuscripts, glancing around as if ensuring no one observed. Then, with careful hands, the individual began manipulating the ledgers, subtly adjusting entries and retrieving a small folio. The precision was remarkable, and Holmes's excitement was barely contained. "Notice, Watson," he murmured, "how the perpetrator mimics Cavendish's own meticulous habits. Every movement is designed to avoid suspicion, yet the pattern of disturbance is unmistakable to one trained in observation. Our manipulator is revealing themselves, unconsciously guided by their own overconfidence." I watched as the figure worked, noting the subtle interactions with the environment. A ledger nudged, a manuscript replaced slightly askew, a faint dust smudge ignored. Holmes's eyes gleamed as he recognized the sequence of actions, connecting each minor irregularity into a coherent narrative. "Now," he whispered, "the final act approaches. The manipulator will attempt to retrieve the folio and remove it from the society, believing the path to be concealed. At that moment, our understanding will crystallize, and the pattern of motive will become undeniable." The figure lifted the folio, and a faint sigh of relief seemed to accompany the movement, as if satisfaction had been attained. Holmes motioned for me to observe closely, the subtle glance toward the side alley, the careful calculation of exit points, and the almost imperceptible hesitation as the individual considered potential witnesses. "Observe the hesitation, Watson," Holmes said softly. "Confidence tempered by fear, every thought, every gesture is a clue. And yet they remain unaware that their behavior is being scrutinized not by chance, but by deliberate observation. In a few moments we shall possess the evidence required to reconstruct the entire design." The manipulator, satisfied that the folio was secure, began retracing the steps toward the alley, unaware that our presence had gone undetected. Holmes' hand moved subtly toward the pocket where he had prepared a signal, a combination of movement and verbal cue designed to alert Lestrade and Penhaligon. "Patience," he whispered. "Only patience. The reveal is imminent, and with it the truth of Cavendish's disappearance shall begin to surface." As I noted every detail, I could sense Holmes's excitement growing, tempered by the utmost caution. The hours of preparation, the delicate manipulations, the patient orchestration of circumstances, all were converging toward a pivotal moment. The manipulator, confident in secrecy, was now guided by their own compulsions, unwittingly revealing the intentions behind the disappearance and the theft of the folio. By evening, Holmes indicated that our observation was sufficient. "We have forced the hand, Watson. The unseen actor has acted according to their own design, unaware that we are privy to every step. The next stage is to follow discreetly, gather final confirmations, and prepare for the confrontation that will bring the pattern into full clarity. The stakes have risen, but the game is now firmly in our control." As we departed the vantage point, I reflected on the day's events. Holmes's strategic play had transformed the investigation from passive observation into active orchestration. The manipulator's overconfidence and predictable habits had been leveraged against them, setting the stage for an inevitable revelation. I could feel the tension in the air, the sense that the climax of our efforts was approaching, and that every clue, every subtle observation, would soon coalesce into a final, inescapable truth. The following morning, Baker Street lay bathed in a muted light, the fog lifting just enough to reveal the uneven cobblestones of the thoroughfare below. Holmes moved about our sitting room with a purposeful energy, his mind clearly already mapping the events of the previous day onto the intricate puzzle he had been assembling in private. I observed him with the mixture of awe and apprehension that always accompanied moments just before the culmination of his investigations. "Watson," he said at length, "the time has come to elucidate the design that has governed the disappearance of Edmund Cavendish and the removal of the folio. Our manipulator, confident in their skill, has acted according to pattern. Every hesitation, every subtle action, every detail unnoticed by others has been preserved in our observations. The evidence now forms a coherent whole, revealing intention with absolute clarity." I leaned forward, eager yet cautious. "Holmes, are you certain we are ready? It seems the threads are numerous, yet I trust your judgment implicitly." Holmes smiled faintly, the faint curve of triumph in his expression betraying the satisfaction he derived from the culmination of careful deduction. "We are not only ready, Watson, but obliged to act. The misdirections have been laid bare, the pattern reconstructed, and the true architect of these events will be revealed." We set out for the Royal Historical Society once more, Holmes walking with a quiet authority, his gaze sweeping every corridor, every shelf, as if absorbing the very essence of the building. Penhaligon greeted us anxiously, his demeanour reflecting the tension that had been building for days. "Gentlemen," he said, wringing his hands, "I fear the manuscript's removal has caused irreparable damage. If Cavendish is not recovered, the implications for the society are severe." Holmes placed a reassuring hand on his colleague's shoulder. "Patience, Mr. Penhaligon. All shall be explained. The resolution lies not in panic, but in careful attention to the subtleties that others overlook." Holmes directed us to the study where the previous night's manipulations had been observed. I noted the subtle disturbances, the slightly displaced ledger, the folio missing from its customary place, the faint chalk residue on the floor. These were, as Holmes had suggested, not mere remnants of past action, but signals of human intention, waiting to be interpreted. "Observe, Watson," Holmes said, kneeling beside the ledger, "the manner in which the folio was removed. The perpetrator handled it with care, respecting its value, yet attempted to conceal their actions through misdirection, subtle adjustments, slight disturbances elsewhere, a psychological smokescreen. This is the hallmark of an individual both knowledgeable and meticulous, yet overconfident in their own cunning." I noted his words, attempting to reconcile them with the impressions I had gathered during our surveillance. The identity of the manipulator seemed tantalizingly within reach, yet I could not anticipate the full scope of the revelation Holmes had prepared. Holmes rose, moving to the adjacent shelf where the manuscript had been replaced after removal. He tapped a volume lightly with his finger. "And here, Watson, lies the linchpin of our discovery." The folio returned itself not through carelessness, but through deliberate placement. The individual responsible attempted to restore appearances, believing themselves undetected. Yet the pattern of dust, chalk, and subtle impressions betrays the timing, direction, and identity of the actor. Holmes motioned for Penhaligon to join us. "Mr. Penhaligon, consider the intervals recorded in the ledgers and journals. The visits of Mr. Harrington coincide with anomalies in the catalogue, yet they do not align with the removal or replacement of the folio. Therefore, we must look elsewhere, to an individual whose movements were unnoticed precisely because they operated within familiar parameters, the inner workings of the society itself." Penhaligon's eyes widened, "but that leaves only Precisely, Holmes said, his voice steady yet charged with revelation. The individual closest to Cavendish with unrestricted access and intimate knowledge of his habits is Mr. Penhaligon. Penhaligon paled, his hand instinctively clutching the edge of the desk. Holmes, I assure you? Holmes held up a hand, silencing him. Allow me for a moment to explain the sequence, and then you shall see the clarity of our deductions. The folio of unusual significance was noted in Cavendish's ledger as pending verification of authenticity. Our manipulator, aware of both its value and Cavendish's devotion, orchestrated a disappearance to retrieve it. They created misdirection anonymous letters, calculated disturbances, and deliberate manipulations of the environment to suggest external involvement. The hand of Mr. Harrington was invoked as a red herring intended to draw attention away from the true source of interference. I watched Penhaligon, who seemed simultaneously horrified and incredulous. Holmes continued, "The secret clue, Watson, the displaced tile, the chalk dust, the subtle impression of footprints all pointed to an actor operating within the society, someone who could move unnoticed among the volumes, aware of Cavendish's habits and capable of predicting his reactions. Each minor inconsistency, each carefully observed detail, aligned perfectly with the knowledge and access possessed by Mr. Penhaligon." The archivist's voice trembled. "But my intentions were the manuscripts. Yes, I handled them, but I never meant harm to Edmund. It was merely Holmes's eyes glinted. Precisely. Intent is immaterial when actions have consequences beyond what one anticipates. You sought access, Mr. Penhaligon, to secure manuscripts you considered at risk, yet your manipulations inadvertently endangered Cavendish. He was guided psychologically, not violently, through a series of actions that removed him temporarily from sight. The removal of the folio, the careful restoration, and the subtle disturbances all were part of a design that failed to account for the meticulous observation and deduction now brought to bear. I sat in stunned silence, attempting to reconcile the outward civility of Penhaligon with the careful orchestration Holmes had revealed. The elegance of the misdirection, combined with the subtlety of motive, demonstrated yet again the depth of human complexity that Holmes so expertly unravelled. Holmes moved closer to the centre of the study. "Watson, note that the apparent simplicity of this case, the missing man, the stolen folio, belied a sequence of intention designed to obscure both identity and motive. By observing the minutiae, reconstructing the timing of actions, and interpreting the faintest irregularities, we arrive at the truth. The misdirections, the false leads, and the carefully constructed veneer all crumble under the scrutiny of deduction." Penhaligon sank into a chair, his face pale. "I see now I never realized the extent I thought I was protecting the manuscripts." Holmes inclined his head. "Intent and outcome are rarely synonymous, Mr. Penhaligon. The mind may act with prudence, yet the consequences may stray beyond calculation. The lesson is clear. Even the most conscientious intentions must yield to transparency and accountability when human lives and historical treasures are at stake." I sat back, still absorbing the revelation. The case, so carefully layered with deception, had unfolded in a manner that left no detail unexplained. The misdirections were not merely coincidental. They had been deliberate, designed to exploit human assumptions, yet Holmes's methodical observation and analysis revealed the truth with precise inevitability. As we left the society that evening, the mist clinging to the gas lamps, I reflected on the sheer magnitude of Holmes' intellect. A single clue, a faint smudge, a displaced tile, a subtle variation in routine, has provided the key to unravelling a complex web of human intention. Cavendish's disappearance, the stolen folio, and the carefully orchestrated misdirections had all been illuminated by the patient and precise mind of my extraordinary friend. Holmes, ever modest in demeanour, yet resolute in insight, paused at the doorway to Baker Street. "Watson," he said quietly, "demonstrates that human nature, even when disciplined and conscientious, can be manipulated by those who understand its rhythms. Observation, deduction, and patience are the instruments by which we pierce deception. Let us now consider how best to ensure Cavendish's safe return and the preservation of the manuscripts. The game is won, though the final act remains." The day following the revelation dawned unusually bright, a rarity in London of late, and yet even the pale sunlight seemed incapable of dispelling the weight of recent events. Holmes and I arrived at the Royal Historical Society just as the morning bell tolled, its echo carrying across the misty streets. Penhaligon awaited us, seated stiffly in the director's office, his countenance a mixture of guilt, relief, and apprehension. The atmosphere was tense, the culmination of the previous day's revelations having left all parties uncertain of what was to come. Holmes spoke first, his tone calm but authoritative. "Mr. Penhaligon, our task is now to secure both the safety of Mr. Cavendish and the preservation of the manuscripts. The actions of yesterday have clarified the sequence of events, and it is imperative that we move deliberately rather than react impulsively." Penhaligon's hands trembled slightly as he rose to his feet. "Holmes, I am prepared to comply fully. I never intended harm to Edmund or the Society's collections. My actions were misguided, but I acted in what I believed to be the best interest of the archives." Holmes inclined his head, his dark eyes fixed upon the archivist. "Intent, while instructive, does not negate consequence. The manuscripts remain vulnerable, and the disappearance of Mr. Cavendish must be addressed immediately. We shall proceed with caution, but with resolute purpose. Your cooperation is essential." We were led to a small antechamber adjacent to the Society's storage rooms, where Holmes had previously noted subtle disturbances, traces of chalk, displaced tiles, and faint smudges indicating movement. Here, Holmes paused, examining the environment with painstaking attention to detail. He crouched to the floor, his long fingers tracing the outlines of the faint marks. "Observe, Watson," he said, "the subtle traces left behind. They indicate Cavendish's movement after he was guided from his office. The manipulator's intentions were clever, yet predictable to one trained in observation. By following these minute indications, we can reconstruct the path and ensure his recovery without further complication." Penhaligon's voice was low, tinged with anxiety, but where could Edmund have been taken? He would never stray far without reason, yet the streets are vast, and London teems with possible locations. Holmes' eyes glimmered with certainty. Precisely why observation and deduction are indispensable. The path is narrow, constrained by habits, knowledge, and the desire to avoid suspicion. The same traits that made Cavendish vulnerable also permit us to anticipate his whereabouts. We shall proceed to a location determined not by chance, but by reasoning guided by knowledge of the man and the minutiae of human behaviour. We followed a sequence of subtle indicators through the Society and down a narrow side street, the city's usual bustle muted by our urgency. Holmes led with a precision that suggested he had already calculated the steps of Cavendish and his unwitting guide. I, as ever, attempted to keep pace, noting every detail for later recording. Finally, Holmes paused before a modest townhouse, its front door slightly ajar. "Here, Watson, is where the culmination of yesterday's orchestration has taken place. The folio, the subtle misdirections, and the manipulations all converge upon this location. Cavendish is here, safe but constrained by circumstance rather than harm." We entered the residence cautiously. There, seated at a small desk, was Edmund Cavendish, his expression a mixture of relief and perplexity upon seeing us. Holmes approached him, his voice gentle but firm. "Mr. Cavendish, you have been absent under circumstances engineered to exploit your dedication and habits. Rest assured, you are now secure, and the path of your disappearance has been fully reconstructed." Cavendish rose, shaking my hand with an air of gratitude. "Dr. Watson, Mr. Holmes, I cannot begin to fathom the intricacy of what has transpired. I was aware of no coercion, yet found myself moved along a path I do not recall consciously. Was it retrieved safely?" Holmes inclined his head. "Yes, the manuscript remains intact, its provenance preserved. Its movement, along with your temporary absence, was orchestrated by Mr. Penhaligon, who acted with intentions misaligned with prudence. Your recovery is now complete, and the sequence of actions reconstructed. Penhaligon, who had followed us, bowed his head deeply. Edmund, I did not foresee the consequences. I believed only to protect the manuscripts, not to imperil you. I am prepared to face the Society's judgment and any consequences deemed necessary." Holmes regarded him with a measured gaze. "Your actions, though misguided, were constrained by knowledge of the archives and of Cavendish's habits. They demonstrate both the peril and potential inherent in intimate understanding. The consequences of human intention, even with conscientious purpose, can be severe when misapplied. Transparency and caution must guide scholarly devotion as much as expertise and diligence." As the morning progressed, Cavendish returned to the Society, escorted by Holmes and myself, while Penhaligon remained under observation, his cooperation essential to resolving any remaining uncertainties regarding the manuscripts. I watched the interaction between Holmes and Cavendish, noting the archivist's quiet awe and gratitude. Holmes, as always, maintained an air of modest detachment, though I could discern satisfaction in his meticulous reconstruction of events. Later, as we returned to Baker Street, I asked Holmes quietly, "Was it the overconfidence of Penhaligon that allowed you to reconstruct the events so precisely?" Holmes' eyes twinkled faintly. "Partly, Watson. Overconfidence is a flaw that often betrays intention. Yet it is the alignment of subtle evidence, the disturbed tiles, chalk dust, ledger irregularities, and human patterns that allows prediction and resolution. One may anticipate consequences without confronting motive directly. Observation, analysis, and patience reveal the truth. The game is rarely won by force, it is won by understanding." As evening fell, I reflected upon the remarkable series of events. The manipulations, misdirections, and secret clues had all converged to create a puzzle of extraordinary subtlety. Holmes had unveiled the truth not through coercion or confrontation, but through an almost preternatural understanding of human behavior, reconstructing intention from the faintest traces of action. For my part, I was left with awe and a lingering sense of wonder at the power of intellect applied to human affairs. The consequences for Penhaligon were sobering, yet I could not help but admire the thoroughness and precision with which Holmes had orchestrated the recovery of both Cavendish and the endangered manuscript. As we settled into our familiar evening routine at Baker Street, Holmes reclined in his chair, pipe in hand, eyes distant. "Watson," he said quietly, "the case is concluded in terms of discovery, yet it offers lessons beyond mere resolution. Observation must be constant, reasoning meticulous, and human understanding profound. Otherwise, the most conscientious intentions may yield peril rather than protection. Let us hope, in future endeavours, that wisdom guides knowledge with equal diligence." I nodded, recording his words with a mixture of reverence and admiration. The events of the past days had revealed not only the depths of human cunning and the dangers of misapplied knowledge, but also the extraordinary clarity of Holmes's mind, capable of reconstructing the invisible and unravelling the subtle complexities of human action with unparalleled precision. The evening that followed the resolution of Cavendish's disappearance settled over Baker Street with an air of serene finality, the fog having lifted to reveal the warm glow of gas lamps lining the streets. Holmes and I had returned to our sitting room, the events of the past days still vivid in my mind, and yet there was a calmness now, a quiet satisfaction that comes when an intricate puzzle has been fully untangled. Holmes reclined in his favourite armchair, his long fingers clasped behind his head, pipe smouldering gently. He exhaled a thin wisp of smoke and regarded me with that rare, contemplative look he reserved for moments of reflection rather than active deduction. "Watson," he began, his voice soft yet imbued with certainty, "the affairs of the Royal Historical Society have been restored to order, Mr. Cavendish returned to safety, and the manuscript secured. Yet, as always, the lessons extend beyond the mere facts of the case." I settled into my chair, pen poised over my notebook. "Holmes, the resolution was remarkable in its precision. To observe so many subtle details and reconstruct a complex sequence of human behaviour, it is nothing short of genius." Holmes inclined his head slightly, a hint of his usual humility in the gesture. "Genius is a flattering term, Watson, but let us not be carried away by admiration. Observation, deduction, and the careful weighing of probabilities are instruments any diligent mind may employ. The true challenge lies in the recognition of human intention, the understanding of motives hidden beneath layers of habit, pride, and fear." I nodded thoughtfully. "And yet it is precisely your skill in interpreting these subtleties that allows you to predict the manipulator's actions, orchestrate their exposure, and ensure Cavendish's safety. Could we have achieved the same outcome by relying solely upon Scotland Yard's conventional methods?" Holmes smiled faintly, a shadow of amusement crossing his features. "Highly improbable. Conventional methods are often sufficient for overt acts of violence or ordinary theft. But when we deal with deliberate misdirection, psychological manipulation, and the exploitation of predictable human patterns, the ordinary approach proves inadequate. The manipulator's skill lay not in physical force, but in the careful orchestration of behavior. It was intellect against intellect, and only careful observation allowed us to counter it." I reflected upon the implications, the weight of Holmes's insight pressing upon me. And Penhaligon he acted with ostensibly benign intent, yet the consequences were dangerous. How do we reconcile intent with outcome in such cases? Holmes regarded me with a piercing gaze. "Intent and consequence often diverge, Watson. A man may act with conscientious purpose, yet produce peril unintentionally. The key is foresight, restraint, and an understanding of the broader context. Even the most diligent scholar must recognize that knowledge alone is insufficient. Wisdom must guide its application." I made a mental note of his words, pondering the delicate balance between knowledge, action, and responsibility. Holmes, ever meticulous in thought, seemed already to have placed the lessons of this case neatly into the compartments of his mind, each observation catalogued for future reference. A knock at the door interrupted our contemplation. Mrs. Hudson entered with the evening tea, her quiet efficiency a comforting counterpoint to the intellectual turbulence that so often accompanied our investigations. Holmes nodded his thanks, and we resumed our discussion over the warmth of tea, the faint aroma of Earl Grey mingling with the ever-present scent of pipe smoke. "Watson," Holmes continued, his tone softer now, almost philosophical, "cases such as this reveal much about human nature. The veneer of civility, the careful construction of habits, the pride in one's vocation, may be manipulated by those who understand their rhythm. And yet there remains hope, for careful observation, patience, and reason can restore balance, reveal truth, and prevent calamity." I sipped my tea thoughtfully. "Holmes, it is astonishing how you translate minor details, cheek footprints, smudges, ledger entries into the full narrative of human action. To what do you attribute this ability? Holmes's eyes twinkled faintly. Dedication to observation, Watson. A refusal to accept appearances at face value. The habit of questioning, of seeking the invisible patterns beneath the surface. And of course, an abiding interest in the predictability of human nature, which, despite its complexity, follows discernible rhythms when one knows where to look. I was silent for a moment, reflecting on the subtle lessons embedded within the resolution of the vanished archivist case. Cavendish had been guided, unwittingly, by the manipulations of someone he trusted, yet Holmes's careful reconstruction had restored order without resorting to coercion or confrontation beyond what was necessary. The elegance of the solution lay not only in its intellectual brilliance, but in the preservation of dignity, safety, and historical knowledge. Holmes broke the silence, his gaze distant. "Watson, the world is full of mysteries, both grand and minute. Some are obvious, some hidden in plain sight. It is the duty of those attuned to observation and deduction to reveal what others cannot perceive, to apply reason where intuition alone fails. In this we exercise both caution and creativity, patience and strategy." I nodded, realizing that this case, like so many others, had provided lessons beyond the immediate resolution lessons about human behavior, intention, and the consequences of even the most conscientious actions. Holmes' method, though extraordinary, was rooted in a discipline of mind that transformed ordinary details into extraordinary revelations. As night fell, enveloping Baker Street in darkness, I observed Holmes settle once more into his armchair, pipe in hand, his gaze fixed upon some distant thought beyond my comprehension. The day had ended, the case concluded, yet there was a sense of ongoing curiosity in the air, a reminder that mysteries never truly cease, and that the intellect, once honed, is perpetually drawn toward the next enigma. Holmes spoke finally, in a low, reflective tone. "Watson, the resolution of the vanished archivist reminds us that observation is not passive, deduction is not idle speculation, and human behavior is a terrain as intricate as any labyrinth. The lessons we glean here are applicable to all future inquiries. Knowledge, intention, and consequence form an interwoven tapestry, one that requires patience, discernment, and unwavering attention." I recorded his words with reverence, fully aware that I was witnessing once again the extraordinary mind of Sherlock Holmes at work, untangling complexity, restoring order, and illuminating truth where others perceive only shadows. The case had ended, yet the sense of awe, curiosity, and admiration remained, a testament to the brilliance that had transformed ordinary details into a narrative of resolution, understanding, and insight. As the lamps flickered and the night deepened, I realized that the story of Edmund Cavendish, the folio, and the carefully orchestrated misdirection would remain with me not merely as an account of a solved mystery, but as a profound lesson in the art of observation, deduction, and the enduring pursuit of truth.